Hi, and thank you and welcome everybody to my second lunchtime presentation, where this time I'll be introducing different ways that you can integrate cost and schedule risk analyses together within Safran Risk. Or perhaps in hindsight, I should have called this Holistic Risk Analysis, a journey from disintegrated to integrated. Because for many of you in the audience or watching this on catch-up, you're likely somewhere on this journey yourself. So my career in project risk began in 2006, working in what was then called the Highways Agency on their Area 2 Enhanced MAC contract, where the goal was to pursue project risk to a level not yet witnessed on the standard MAC contracts. So this meant that over the duration of the 7 years, we had a mixture of general maintenance and rolling portfolios of projects that we had to identify, study, optioneer, then design and build, with an annual spend of somewhere between 70 million and 120 million per year. So we rolled out an enterprise risk management ERM approach and supported this with Monte Carlo techniques. And as an early career highlight between 2010 and 11, I designed and implemented my own database called the Risk Lessons Learned Register, which essentially was a reference class forecasting approach that also happened to minimize trivial administration for the benefit of everybody on the project. But just to give an oversimplified explanation of our approach towards Monte Carlo back then, we would capture threats and opportunities, assign probabilities and 3-point estimates to a triangle distribution, and that would be to both cost and time impacts. However, those time impacts always came with a notional contingency or prolongation cost calculation that was separate from any form of quantitative schedule risk analyses, and was therefore ignorant to whether impacts would truly be felt on the critical path. There was no estimating uncertainties involved, or whether the simulations would pick up on discrete risk events impacting and accumulating in series or in parallel to one another. So then with my first career move into the major complex design and build projects, to that new domain, the pattern was still an emphasis on cost risk modeling only, with a notional nod towards the costs associated with prolongation. So it just meant that our underlying formulae became more complex to represent different subcontractors or the PMO, all at different rates, at different times and for different durations, with recognition of the valid time-independent additional costs. But now it was becoming painfully obvious that there was much greater exposure to unintentional second and third order consequential impacts. Or to put it another way, the potential feedback loops where events out on site can trigger redesign or resequencing of the other parts of the design and build project. So there's this potential for amplification or domino effects, compounding costs due to impacting risk events, but also, if we're being quite honest, the administration of formal and informal instructions. But interestingly, for those of you that attended my previous session where we looked at the risk-reward relationship when pursuing opportunities, I found that on these mega projects, it was absolutely key that as a contracting organization, we had recognition not just of the direct cost of change, such as additional raw materials, equipment, etc., or even the extra indirect costs for things like increased accommodation, increased waste disposals, etc., but actually how our risk profile was affected afterwards. So we'd see this as a before and after comparison. So for example, bringing in a second tower crane at the other end of the site increases your productivity, but now you are notionally twice as exposed to, say, the high wind speed risk that might trigger a downtime. Now, the disciplined use of time-related cost was absolutely key in articulating these changes in our risk profile to the project manager for things like compensation events, etc. But just for example, imagine that one of our project milestones has slipped due to a mixture of reasons spread across multiple parties, but there is this willingness to explore the cost of recovery versus the cost of merely attempting to maintain the status quo with the existing risk profile. So the existing risk of further delay is a bit of a moot point, because in the current situation, the cost of the delayed milestone is actually greater to the client than necessarily to the contractor. But we can see that there's a total cost of £300,000 to the top sequence of activities there, and that there's a specialist resource that we need spread out over the same 3-month period, and they're going to work for the same amount of money in total, giving a total forecast to complete a cost of £600,000 plus, we'll say 10% risk exposure, just for simplicity. So 660,000 in total at that point of the scenario. So we've worked with the project manager to resequence some of the work such that there's now an overlap of parallel working within our underground construction site, but maintaining the same cost for those 3 items. But it was difficult to find more of the specialist resource to complete that longest activity, to make that go any faster. So we can technically throw more resources at this activity, but the additional resources, they're going to cost double. Furthermore, there's a tangible risk that the original resource that we had on that particular activity will want to renegotiate their rate as compensation for the lost business, but also the difficulties that they will now say that they're exposed to in terms of having to share this overly congested underground work site, potentially 4 times as many people down inside that box than was originally planned for. And also, they now have this potential for frustrated access and egress and other new systemic risks that just simply weren't there before. And there's this contagion potential that is there now. So we'll be using a 20% risk exposure for this post-opportunity example. So the net position is that the accelerated works will cost an extra £200,000 more, which is a 33% uplift on the original price. However, the risk exposure has not increased commensurately at all, but has in fact more than doubled. Now, what's interesting is that the way people can easily conflate these two relatively simple ideas. There's additional cost invested to purchase an enhanced position, but simultaneously believing that this mitigated position is now inherently risk-free, which of course it is not, as I've just kind of outlined. So, you know, for them, sometimes it's just they're putting the foot down on the accelerator pedal and assuming a risk-free ride lies ahead, but the truth of the matter is that you've now got less margin for error. So should things go wrong, they'll go wrong faster and be more expensive. And as we've already exhausted our best mitigation measures in terms of actually implementing this change, there's now actually no airbag or no roadside recovery to continue the analogy. There's just only the raw consequences of our collective decision making here, this position we're in. And as far as I'm concerned, it's just no different to the physics of driving a car faster and needing to account for ever increasing stopping distances, which could be thought of as a form of contingency against the risk of harm from an emerging accident. Anyways, but I guess hopefully you can see the pain and difficulties faced when both internal and external stakeholders are scrutinizing spreadsheet after spreadsheet to discern where the uplifts are coming from and the reasons why they've got increased costs, but where the feedback loops and the dependencies, the correlations are effectively hidden because they're not mapped, they're not present in all these different spreadsheets necessarily. So this is why having a singular integrated model is going to be far more helpful in comparing these two scenarios. So let's just quickly remind ourselves of what being integrated means. So it's to combine and coordinate separate elements as to provide a harmonious, interrelated whole. So in my career examples thus far, I've really been struggling to get away from a disintegrated position, which is the opposite of this. But even when I moved more directly into the rail sector in my career, where I'd heard that the QSRA was common practice, and whilst this I found to be true, I still find that the requirements were to model cost risk and schedule risk independently of one another, often using at-risk, the Microsoft Excel extension, and OPRA respectively in those situations. I did, however, begin to make some progress by introducing cost uncertainty modelling of the CBS, the cost breakdown structure, alongside the risk register for projects such as Gatwick Airport railway station development, which is actually another career highlight, really, you know, personally speaking, because actually I could tangibly sense that my modelling was helping to directly influence stakeholder decisions and triggering fresh investigations, further optioneering. But it wasn't until I joined High Speed 2 on the main works project that a tangible opportunity arose in my career to investigate beyond merely interfacing two separate cost and schedule risk models together. And as I often note week in and week out when talking to people about this subject, I've just always found it to be the most curious thing that we all intuitively know that scope risk can increase both cost and duration, and that increased durations will consequently increase time-dependent costs as well. But that level of integration is still just typically not there. Inferior substitute methods are deployed instead, and that can provide misleading outputs potentially, or be used to set unrealistic goals or set unrealistic contingencies. And that's where I trialed Safran Risk and essentially found the process of integrating my two risk models to be far less daunting than I was expecting. And now, of course, I found myself promoting it here to you today. But before I give you a quick demonstration in how to integrate both cost and schedule risk models, we do need to talk about a quirk of probabilities. So if I run a schedule risk model with a P80 output and in a separate cost risk model also have a P80 output, do I truly have P80 of achieving both of those targets? Well, not necessarily, because if 80% of the cost outcomes achieve the cost target, they might not also necessarily achieve their schedule targets. So if what we're looking at here is simple mathematical formula. It's just 80% times 80% is 64%, or P64 if you prefer. But then if the cost and the schedule models are also correlated, and there's the confidence of achieving this will be further affected because of, those feedback loops and correlations that are essentially absent. So it's not necessarily going to be as high as P64. So with these additional probability factors at play, let's now take a look at how we can communicate these risk outputs as a relative cost increase or decrease. So you should note that Safran accepts the traditional cost and resource loaded schedule approach, which allows you to define which time-dependent and time-independent costs will be applied at any given time in the schedule. However, we've also provided a simpler alternative method that uses the cost breakdown structure, the CBS, that will be more familiar to your cost estimators and your quantity surveyors. So I'm now going to share a simple example from a fictional project that needs to test fly its manufactured drones on a disused airfield. So you can see here that the hiring of the test site is just a single lump sum base price of £590,000. But what we've then done is linked it to the hammock of the testing phase and then said that 20% of the cost is actually fixed and it's time independent, and that's not going to change in this particular example. So this leaves us with 80% of the costs being time dependent, meaning that as the Monte Carlo stresses the schedule with risk events and uncertainties, we could be hiring this airfield for longer and incurring additional prolongation costs. Or it may even cost us less if time-saving opportunities are realized instead. So what the system is automatically doing for us is taking that variable portion, dividing it by the 107 days that's automatically detected from the schedule connection. And then it's giving us a day rate or a burn rate of 4,411 per day. So for every day beyond the deterministic duration, it'll cost this much more. And for every day saved, it'll save this much money. And we can also see that because we've mapped this cost to a bunch of activities within the hammock, that this cost is going to be incurred here within our deterministic cash flow profile, which you can see moving around with each iteration of the step through during the simulation. Or if you prefer, we have a probabilistic cash flow report, which essentially is a risk-adjusted cash flow. So here you can see what we've got is the expected deterministic costs associated with just hiring the airfield, shown in these grey coloured bars. We have some monthly spends ramping up and then peaking for 3 months and then ramping down again. But now, if we overlay the risk-adjusted or P80 probabilistic position, firstly, it suggests that we'll start on site a couple of months late. And secondly, we'll be hiring for a full 8 months thereafter. And the scatter plot overlay is potentially useful in helping you to spot outliers at the extreme ends of your sampled ranges to your time and cost axes. So let's now take a closer look at the scatter plot. So once all your suitable aspects of the project schedule have been integrated with the appropriate prorated costs, we can illustrate the difference between a holistic integrated model and two separate disintegrated cost and schedule risk models and show these side by side. Now here we can see a random and coincidental spread of results plotted in terms of cost and schedule, and statistically speaking, both correlation values are below 30%. Very low correlation between these two things. We can also see there's the black star near the bottom left-hand corner that represents the deterministic or planned duration and cost, and that it sits within the green quadrant. So the crosshair that I've drawn is dynamic and allows me to draw the 4 quadrants wherever I wish. So I've manually set mine to show the 10% cost contingency and 10% time contingency of the overall project deterministic planned values. And so within these parameters, there's only about 6% of all the random outcomes are landing within this quadrant. Now here's exactly the same project, but with the time-dependent costs fully integrated with the schedule. The two most notable changes are firstly the spread or the shape of the outputs. It now forms a more correlated cloud with a diagonal vector, which is also corroborated by the statistical correlation now being circa 80%. Which, the closer you're getting to 100%, the closer you are to a one-to-one relationship between the two selected variables being measured. But we can also see that the cost axis, worst case, has now jumped from 14 million to 17.5 million pounds. So the feedback loops are kicking in as appropriate and prolongation costs are being accounted for. So the power of having a fully integrated model shown on the scatter plot is that you can now talk about having joint confidence in your model's outputs. So previously in my career, if I was interfacing two disintegrated models together, I perhaps shouldn't have been claiming P80 confidence or even P64 confidence. As I said, this is quietly ignoring those feedback loops and correlated relationships that are occurring in real life, and regardless of whether or not your model was sophisticated enough to be capturing them. But in practice, we can start with a graphic like this, where our 10% contingency proposal is netting only 15% of all the iterations. So naturally, we're going to want to improve this. So a new model is run. It imagines a post-mitigated scenario where we've increased our catch to 60% of all the iterations. But still, we might not be satisfied, as our project risk management plan might state that we need to achieve P80 confidence. So this then poses a new question: where in this cloud of outputs do we pitch our contingency? So Safran will help you find this by allowing you to switch your view to show joint confidence levels, JCL, as a spectrum of possible outcomes. So here we can see the legend's now been changed. We've got some new colors on display, and this is showing, this is fully customizable to show the focus percentiles that we're interested in. So I'm interested in the P80. So that means I'm interested in the liminal zone where the amber and the red colors meet. And ideally, for a starting point, you're looking at a neutral initial pitch that doesn't favor cost over schedule and vice versa. So aiming for the inflection point of the blue curve, which I've added on for emphasis there, which you'll sometimes hear this referred to as the necklace. But essentially, it's a continuum, and wherever you redraw that crosshair along that curve, you'll find 80% of the plot points are found within the bottom left-hand quadrant. So that's how it's behaving. So after we've nudged the crosshair to this revised position, you have the evidence of the model sampling to inform your team on where is most appropriate and viable as a contingency proposal. And in this case, we've nudged what was just a gut feel 10% contingency proposal up to 13%, and that's helping us to achieve our desired JCL of P80. So by using the joint confidence levels and spotting patterns of correlation, you can use this to support contextual recommendations regarding multiple possible courses of action or inaction to various what-if opportunities and mitigation proposals by sensing their likely cost and schedule impact against specific objectives, such as the hiring of the airfield example that we went through earlier, as well as using probabilistic cash flow to adjust expectations or baselines on where funding levels are going to be required at any given time. But as a profession, we should be moving away from the days of simply mirroring back to the senior team the same list of top 10 risks that they probably provided to us in the first place. So let's give them a choice to make that has some meaningful ramifications. We can use sensitivity analysis to discover where 80% of the impact is actually coming from following that Pareto principle, and then discover what potentially is relating these things together. And it's also possible to discern direct scope cost increases and indirect prolongation costs and associations or associated durations via this sensitivity analysis report as well. And it's all to do with how you set the model up and how you use the correlation matrix to express the full freedom of the modeling variables that is on offer to you. But you can do that for internal variables as well as external to the project variables. So it's up to you how you want to look at this, but you could be modeling delay penalties or financial year inflationary uplifts, which could be modeled conditionally on an iteration by iteration basis. Alternatively, if you want to achieve more direct control through the CBS approach, there are options to change where in time the costs will be incurred, but also you could express this as formula, which I'm sure many of you have got experience in using Microsoft Excel spreadsheet-based approaches to modeling, so you feel quite comfortable, possibly even more so with taking this approach rather than the schedule connection approach I demonstrated earlier. But there's a great deal of flexibility on offer here, so much so that if you really wanted to, you could use a combination of the base price uncertainty mixed in with the quantity uncertainty to roughly emulate the behavior of the traditional cost resource loaded schedule approach, which just gives you yet another option for you to consider in your approach here. Okay, so some final thoughts on my journey with integrated risk models, and just as I draw the presentation to a close. So firstly, I guess I've confirmed and verified that my suspicions of interfacing disintegrated models were entirely true. So especially on the larger, more complex projects. So we really need to be accommodating for this with additional modeling to compensate for that. Secondly, it's a very natural way to stimulate collaboration between schedulers and cost engineers, hopefully discovering those incompatible plans where the scheduler intends for something to be quick and efficient, but where others were perhaps hoping to relieve cost pressures. So, perhaps fast and cheap isn't what the project actually needs, and it may lead to some useful conversations or indeed useful scenario modeling by your friendly neighborhood risk guy to help you make those decisions. Thirdly, at least where Safran Risk is concerned, there are multiple possible approaches to the cost and schedule integration and the correlations. So it means if you are time poor, there's probably a viable solution for you. But if you have the extra capacity and your project culture sees the value in it and will support you in helping you get there, you could start adding some bells and whistles. But essentially, it's easier than you might think, and running quick and dirty analysis on those embryonic schedules, combining those with very high level cost breakdown structures, for instance, that can still be insightful, even when the project definition is quite poor. Even if it's not going to be accurate in the George box sense that all models are wrong anyway, but some are going to be useful. And then fourth, just by ensuring that time is converted into cost and vice versa, you more readily produce decision grade insights for senior managers. For them to know that the feedback loops and the correlations are in place gives them greater confidence in understanding the trade-offs that you might be asking them to consider as part of the output of your model. So seeing how a milestone's JCL trends under various different scenarios, or then how that affects the cash flow of any given period, these are all unique outputs to a truly holistic and integrated risk model. So I hope this has been interesting, and especially to the vast majority of project teams who don't work in the oil and nuclear industries that perhaps already do this integrated approach as standard. But if you want to find out more, browse the materials or just chat, please come to our sponsored room and download a 30-day free trial from our website, safran.com, to start playing around with the themes discussed today and indeed last week as well. But I'd also encourage you to join us with hundreds of other Safran Risk users at our conference in 3 weeks' time, where we'll also have many guest speakers, including our keynote from Alexander Larsen, who will be giving us all tips on how to sharpen up our communication of risk to stakeholders. Last year's event was a blast, so I'm really looking forward and excited to this year's as well, where of course I'll be speaking again. But thank you all for your time, and again, thanks to the APM IRM for inviting us to speak. So thank you.